attack my warehouses. You kill my beans. What do you want from me?
My guns would be nice.
Hey guys, and welcome to the making of Killer Bean Forever. And in the next several minutes, I'm gonna go over the entire process of how I made this movie, and hopefully you guys can get some tips or hints or whatever, clues or advice or I don't know, on how to make an animated feature film on your own if you wanted to. But don't do it. It's crazy. Anyway, Killer Bean Forever. So I wanted to be a filmmaker ever since I was a kid. And all through middle school, all through high school, I was making home movies with my friends, like kung fu movies, action movies, sci-fi movies, all sorts of things. And I really wanted to do that for a living. But I went to engineering for college and not what I wanted to do. So after college, I said, okay, if you really want to be a filmmaker, you got to make your movie. You got to make a movie. So at the time it was 1995, and to make a quality movie, not just a home video, you had to use film, because back then there was no HD, there's no, not even a progressive scan camera, and the video looked really bad back then. So I said to myself, how can I make a movie that looked like a movie, but I can make it at home, So I thought about it and I said, okay, what if I used animation? Because back then, computer animation was just starting up. It was just getting its feet under itself, I guess you could say. So you can actually buy software for your home computer, which I did. I bought some software and I got myself a PC and I started learning animation. So for the next couple of years, I learned animation and I created a character to practice animation with. And so he was like a sphere with two hands and two legs. So I said, okay, what do I do with this? So I gave him two guns, and thus he became Killer Bean. I decided, okay, let's just jump right into it. Let's just start making shorts. Let's make animated short films. So for the next 5 months or 6 months, I created Killer Bean 1, The Interrogation. And this was really supposed to be something to practice animating with. It wasn't supposed to be something good or anything like that. It was supposed to be just me learning animation, and I released it on the internet, and it got like a small following. It got like 3,000 views, and people kind of liked it. They liked the action in it, stuff like that. So I said, okay, this is a possibility. I could kind of do this. So I practiced enough for about 2 years, and I started working in animation, doing visual effects for movies and stuff like that. But I would always go home and work on my own stuff. And the next thing I was working on was Killer Bean 2, The Party. And that took about 3 years on my spare time. I would come home around 7 or 7:30 from work, and I would work on it till like midnight. And so I did that for about 3 years. And let's see. And I finished it after 3 years. And I released it on iFilm, and all of a sudden it just blew up. It just took off. And it got about 1 million views in 6 months, which was pretty big for back then. That was back in 2000. And I started getting calls from people in Hollywood, like agents and managers and all that stuff, and studios like saying, oh, blah, 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 blah. I was getting all excited, and I was like, oh man, I'm going to become a director. I'm going to start making my own movies. But, I found out that all that blah, 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 blah was really, that was all it was, just talk. So nothing really happened. And I said, okay, I got to keep making things happen. So I decided, okay, I'm gonna make Killer Bean 3. It's gonna be bigger. It's gonna be much bigger than Killer Bean 2. Killer Bean 2 was 7 minutes. I'm gonna make Killer Bean 3 45 minutes. Because what my goal was, I wanted to make a DVD to actually sell the episode on to people. Yeah, people who would buy the DVD. So I said, if I was gonna make a 45-minute short, and if that was gonna take me like 2 years to make or 3 years, why don't I just work a year or two more and make that a feature film? If that's my whole goal, to be a feature filmmaker, why don't I just do it? Why don't I just make a feature film? I said, okay, yeah. Okay, let's just do it. Let's just make our feature film right now. Like, let's not wait. So I decided, okay, Killer Bean 3 was going to become Killer Bean Forever, my feature film directorial debut. So Killer Bean Forever, feature film. Yeah, I'm writing a screenplay. And I wanted Killer Bean Forever to happen right after Killer Bean 2. I wanted to know the story. I wanted to tell the story of what happens right after that night. Not like a week later or a year later. Like right after that party. The next morning, what happens? So I thought it would be interesting to tell about the characters it affects and who Killer Bean was and why he did that and what is he going after and who he is and things like that. So I started writing the screenplay. It took about 5 months to make the first draft, and then I decided to just go right into previs, right into pre-visualizing the movie. And I did that because I thought about it and I said, I can't really draw that well, and if storyboarding the whole movie out would kind of be a waste of time, because I could I could create a shot in previs and it'll be almost as fast as storyboarding. So why not just jump right to previs? And I thought previs would be a more accurate representation of the movie, and people will understand seeing a previs better rather than looking at storyboard frames. And I could get the timing right, I could get the pacing right, I could get the camera shots that I want, I could tell a story with camera motion. Basically the entire movie in front of you, minus all the details. So characters would be, instead of walking around, they would slide around, kind of like ice skating, and there's no textures, there's no color. Yeah, just movie without details. So that took about 9 months. I wanted to have a complete movie, so I added some music to it because I felt music added a lot to the emotion. To if someone's watching it, they could experience it more like they're watching a real thing. So it took about 9 months, and then I had screenings with friends and family, and after each screening, people would have comments, suggestions, what they liked, what they didn't like. So I would go back to the screenplay, change up things, how I thought the movie would be better after that, and then go back to the previs, change up things to reflect the new changes in the screenplay, and then I would have more screenings. And I did it about 3 times. So after the third time, I considered it was done. The previs was done. It took me about a year and a half for the whole screenplay to end of the previs production. That took about a year and a half, and I said, okay, I got to start making this thing because I could fiddle with the previs forever. So yeah, pre-production was about a year and a half. And what's after previs? So after previs, I decided to cast the voices, do some concept art, and also start modeling the final characters. One of the big mistakes that I made was that I didn't do the concept art before the previs, which was a huge mistake, because I created characters, I created models for the previs, and then I did concept work. I had a great concept artist. His name was Von Caberte from the Philippines, and he just nailed the look of Killer Bean. And what I did was I sent him descriptions of each character. I told him what they looked like, what they did, what their personality is, and what their purpose was in the movie. And he would draw what he thought the beans would look like. And there were some characters that had a little bit back and forth, some more than others, and he just nailed the look on all of them. He just nailed the look on all the characters. He also designed Killer Bean's car. So yeah, check him out. Go to I'm gonna have to email you to. I'll email you the website. I'll put it up on the screen, like right there. All right, that's his website. Okay, so yeah, he did the concept art, and my big mistake was I didn't do this before the previs because this drawing of this character is much different than what I had in the previs. So I had to go back and remodel all the characters, and all the work I did in the previs I can't use. I really couldn't use because the models are all different. The scale of the models are all different, and all I could use the previs for was for editing purposes, for timing purposes of the scenes, but I could have used it for a lot more. So what I'm saying is do your concept work before previs so you can use your previs more towards the final animation, more towards the final, production. So that was the previs part. And at the same time, while this work was going on, I decided to cast actors to play the roles of these characters. So I put an ad out in Craigslist and stuff like that, and it was like, man, I got a lot of headshots and emails from actors, and I auditioned about 20 actors, and I casted about 4 of them, and each of these 4 actors were ultra talented. They can perform multiple voices. They came from all different backgrounds. 2 of them were voice actors primarily, and that was Brian and Vegas. So they did a lot of voice acting work. And then David came from the theater, and he did a lot of independent film work. And Matt did a lot of independent film work. So man, they were all talented, and they were all fun to work with. So they were cast, and I kind of set up this makeshift studio in my bedroom, and I bought all this like egg crate foam paddings, and I lined the walls with them. It got really hot, really hot because it insulates the place, but it stopped the sound from bouncing off the walls. And if you're listening to this featurette, I didn't pad the walls here, so the sound might be echoing. So yeah, if you do that, it'll prevent all that echoing from your voice. So I had I had 2 microphones. One of them's like right here. I'll show it to you right here. Nothing special, just like $100 microphone. And I had 2 of them because I wanted that 2-person dynamic with 2 actors playing off of each other, especially for scenes where the two characters are in a scene together, and it's not just some casual conversation. It's some like mono or being on being versus being kind of scene. I wanted the acting to reflect that kind of dynamic. I wanted it to seem like it was real. And I think if you just had one microphone and you record the actors one at a time, you'll kind of lose that. One actor might act dialogue one way, but then another actor might act in another way, and then to kind of try to match that and make it look like it's fitting into one scene will be kind of difficult. And it would take lots of different takes, and I would have to figure out which one worked best, So having 2 microphones at the same time was really nice. It was really nice to get the performances I wanted. Yeah, working with the actors was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun because it was like really creative, and it was in the moment type of thing, as opposed to like doing this, like, that type of thing. What did I do? Anyway, that type of thing where I'm just sitting around. But interacting with the actors was cool because it felt like a filmmaking process to me. So the actors came in usually on the weekends because everyone had different jobs during the day. So scheduling wise, we kind of did. I recorded like 1 actor at a time when scheduling didn't work, but at times I overlapped 2 actors at a time, and we kind of recorded out of sequence like most movies do. You don't start from the beginning of the screenplay. You basically take all the scenes that actor's in, and you just record all those scenes while you have the actor, in that room with you. So all of that was shot or recorded out of sequence, and it was all recorded on 24-bit audio. So once that all was done, I took all the audio, decided which takes I wanted, And there was times when I actually had to take two different parts from two different takes because I thought maybe the first half of one take was better, and then the second half of the other take was better. So I spliced it together and created one super take. And so that took about a month just to pick my takes and kind of clean up the audio, take out lots of pops and crackles. And I used Adobe Audition for that, and a very nice program, very, very easy to use, and it did everything I wanted. And so after the audio was selected, I took all those takes and I put it back into my previs. And when you're working with actors, sometimes there's a lot of improv going on and dialogue changes. It's not like word for word, that you wrote in your screenplay. So my previs had to be re-edited to fit the length of the shots of what the new audio takes were. So yeah, all that took about a month, and I think I finished pre-production in July 2005, and all the models were ready to go. The previs was done. That was it, yeah. So, okay. So July 2005, I was set to go. I had all my models. Okay, yeah, I was set to go. So August was a big month. August, I had to figure out, okay, I got this previs, which was my blueprint. The previs with the new audio was exactly what I wanted to be in the movie. And all I had to do was replace the shots with final shots. And after the previs was done, there was really not much creative work going on, because all the creativity came during the pre-production, which was writing it, figuring out camera angles, directing actors, all that stuff. All that, concept art, that's all creative. Once we get into production, it's all not so much creative. It's a lot of grunt work. It's a lot of repetitive kind of chore-like motion. Sure, animation is creative to a point, but it's only creative within your own single shot. As an animator, I could be creative, but I can't be creative like a director during production, because that's going to change my previs. Once the previs is done, it's locked down. So that's my blueprint. So what I had to do in August was figure out how the heck was I going to do this? I had 85 minutes, an 85-minute previs, and that took a year and a half, and I had to create final animation for 85 minutes. That's pretty crazy. So, yeah, to kind of put it in perspective, I worked on lots of different movies. I worked on Matrix Reloaded. That was like a 2-year production. About 2 years, a little more than 2 years. And in those 2 years, I animated on 20 shots, like final animation. There was a lot of other work going on, like previs, all that stuff, figuring out R&D and all that stuff. But yeah, I animated on 20 shots, about 20 shots on that movie in about over 2 years. And I worked on Transformers 2 most recently. That was a 5-month production, and I worked on 12 shots on that. So if you kind of do the math, it's kind of like they give you about a week to a month per shot, depending on how many characters are in that shot or how tough that shot is. You get about a week to a month to finish that shot. So I was like, okay, Killer Bean Forever had over 1,000 shots. If I was going to take a week to do a shot for 1,000 shots, that's like 1,000 divided by 52. That's like 20 weeks. No, wait. 1,000 divided by 52. That's like 20 years. That's like 20 years. So how the heck was I going to finish this movie in less than 20 years? I wanted to finish it in about 4 years. Eventually, it took about 5 years. So already a year and a half was taken up in pre-production. I gave myself about 2 years to do the animation. Eventually, it ended up being about 3 years. So how the heck was I supposed to finish 85 minutes of animation in 3 years? I had to figure out something. And so I ran a test. In August, I decided to create some new thing to help me speed up animation. So I thought about what kind of technology, if I had unlimited money. First of all, if I had unlimited money, I wouldn't be making movies. I'd just be sitting on the beach somewhere. But anyway, if I had unlimited money, what kind of technology could I get to help me speed up my animation process? So there's motion capture, which is putting points on your body. You know the whole thing. Putting points in your body, and then cameras track that point, and then those points control the character. And I said, okay, the cheapest motion capture system at the time was about $50,000. And if I had $50,000, I'd be spending it on like rent and food. I wouldn't be spending it on like a thing you could put dots on your body and stuff like that. So I said, okay, I don't have that much money, but I like the idea. I like the idea of motion capture, tracking points. Because really, if I was to animate the movie by hand, over 1,000 shots by hand, like my fastest animation speed is about an hour per finished second for one character. So that's like really fast. I don't want to brag or anything, but damn, that's fast, boy. No, I'm kidding. All right. So yeah, that kind of animation you can't do for a long period of time. If I were to rush, if someone said, "Okay, get this done in like 2 days," then you could sit down and do it, right? You could kind of focus and do it, but after that you'd be pretty pooped out. So doing 1 hour per finished second of animation, that's like, okay, I animate for an hour, I end up getting a second of animation. That is very, it just takes a lot of energy out of you. So if you do that for a whole week, you're going to be burnt out. So I said, okay, I can't keep up that speed for 3 years. I'd be like, I think I would like disappear into space. I'd like stuff like that. So yeah, I had to figure out something that was more like a chore that didn't take a lot of brain power. You know what I mean? Kind of like washing dishes. You're doing them, but you don't know you're washing dishes. So it doesn't really take that much out of you. So I needed something like that. I needed a system that was more like, washing dishes. That was like a chore. And I could kind of daydream and not worry about it too much. So I like the idea of motion capture because it becomes like a chore. And that's why animators hate motion capture, because basically it is kind of like a chore. You're not really being creative. But for this movie, I had to think like a producer. I had to think like, how am I going to get this movie done? Sure, I would like to be creative, but I was just creative for 1.5 years on the pre-production. So during the production, if I was creative for like 2 years, yeah, burnout, totally. So think like a producer, not like an animator. I know animators are going to hate me for this, but hopefully some producers will like me for this. So yeah. Okay, so I said, okay, motion capture's cool, but how can I do it for a lot cheaper? Well, there's this program called SynthEyes, which is a very good tracking software. It's mostly for 2D tracking motion, like camera tracking or object tracking, and it uses one camera to track a 2D object. So I said, okay, I have a 3-dimensional character. I want to be able to control its motion with 2 dimensions. And why don't we check out a scene in Maya, and I can explain what I want to do. Basically, a motion capture system can track a point in X, Y, or Z. That's X going across, Y going up and down, Z in depth. 3 dimensions can track a point moving around in space. A 2D tracking software can track something going in X, something going in Y. So it's like a plane, some point moving around in this plane in space. So if you have that information, I could say, okay, how can I control my character with just a point moving in this plane? Well, say you had a sphere and you had this point moving around in space. How can you control the rotations of a sphere? You basically aim the sphere at this point. And that was the basis of my kind of poor man's motion capture. So basically I tracked myself with a dot on my head and a dot on my nose, and I just acted. I'd acted out the dialogue, reciting the lines that the actors performed. And I kind of overacted. I kind of did like, my head was like, yeah, so what's going on, man? Stuff like that. I kind of overacted the head motions, and it worked quite well. So I tracked those dots, brought it into Maya, and then I constrained my character's head to look at those points in space, and sure enough, the head was doing what my head was doing. Now, the range of motion that I got from that kind of tracking was about 90 degrees. So my head couldn't turn from here to there using this tracking method. I had to do that with some kind of manual adjustment. Like I put a note on top of this head that I would use for just rotations more than 90 degrees. Other than that, I would use the motion capture, the poor man's motion capture. So that was for head acting. That brought a lot of nuance into my animation, because to animate this kind of nuance when I talk, would require like a lot of touch up, back and forth polishing. It would take a while. So with this tracking, I knew it was fine because I recorded it with my own head, and if it tracked well, then that was it. I didn't bother to retouch this kind of animation. If I needed to, I would zoom up the tracked motion to exaggerate the motion a little bit. So the bigger the space the point covered, the wider the range the head moved, things like that. So that worked quite well. And then I kind of extended that idea to track the lips. And what I would do was I had 8 points on my lips. So I got stickers and I drew like dots on the stickers and I taped them to my lips. So 1 here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 points there. And I just looked at the camera, recited the lines that the actors performed. I kind of lip synced, and I tracked all those 8 dots. And I put that motion onto 8 locators in Maya. Then I constrained clusters to those locators, and those clusters controlled the control vertices to my mouth on my character. So that's my whole lip syncing process, and it worked really well. It worked really well. So well that I didn't even touch, or I didn't even adjust the motion capture for the lip syncing. So what you saw in the movie was it. That was straight motion capture. And so my next step was to test it out on a scene. Enough of this R&D stuff. Let's test it out on a real scene. So I chose the scene where Cromwell was in his office talking on a speakerphone, just sitting behind his desk. And I thought that was the perfect scene because he's not really moving around. He's doing a lot of dialogue, and you're close up on his head. So it was perfect. So I edited the scene, in the previs together. All the audio was what I wanted, and then I lip synced it with my mouth. After that, I decided to kind of automate stuff, because before that I had to import each tracked motion into the locator, then constrain clusters to the locators, stuff like that. So this time I said, okay, enough of that. That took too long. That took like about maybe half an hour per lip sync to get that whole thing set up. Now, instead, I decided to automate with Mel scripting. I'm no programmer at all. But the cool thing in Maya is that you can check out what kind of commands that each function does in the computer. So if you click on a button in Maya and you open up the script editor, it'll tell you that exact command in the script editor. So later on, you can copy that command, put it in some Mel script file, and just run that file, and it'll do all the things that you did in Maya. So basically, that's what I did. I went through the entire process once, copied all those commands into one file, and then after that, once the lip sync is tracked, I hit a button, and boom, it's attached to the mouth. The mouth is moving, and all I had to do was put the mouth on a bean, and that was it. That was really a really simple process. And what could I improve on it? Well, that's a tough question, because I plan on doing more advanced characters next time, so it's probably going to have a lot more details, like cheeks or whatever, like actually opening a mouth and stuff like that. For the eyes, I didn't really motion capture because I felt it's easy enough to do the eyes in hand animation, and the pupils, it was easy enough to point where I wanted the pupils to look. So the eyes are definitely hand animated, but head motion and mouth motion were motion captured, and there was not much retouching up of that kind of motion. So after that, I was like, okay, I had this scene and it works. This process works. My next thing to do is to really test it in a real more complicated scene. So I chose the bar scene between Killer Bean and Cromwell, And it's the same type of scenario where they're both sitting down, they're not moving around, and they're behind some bar and they're just talking, interacting with each other. That's the key thing. Two characters interacting with each other. And how was I going to do that with motion capturing just one person, me? So it all came down to the sound editing. So what I did was in the previs edit, I left enough space between dialogue to for room for acting. So I said, okay, if Killer Bean says something like, "Oh, he says this," and it kind of offends Cromwell, then I leave enough room for Cromwell to react, for him to act pretty much. Okay, so they're not just reciting dialogue back and forth because that's kind of dry. I wanted enough time for them to react to the other person's dialogue. So, with that in mind, I had the whole scene in my head. I acted out one character first. I don't know who I did first, either Killer Bean or Cromwell. Probably Cromwell because he had a lot more dialogue. And then I envisioned in my head during those gaps in the dialogue what kind of reaction, what kind of acting that Cromwell had to do. So I would do that with my mouth, or I would do that with my head and, kind of look away and, whatever the acting called for. And I put those two together, and the most complicated part of doing that is making sure that the two lip syncs are kind of synced up, because there's no real way of syncing it while you're shooting it. So I had to either like clap or whatever, and then it was a lot of hand syncing, like shoving the keyframes over like 10 frames or back 20 frames just to line up all the dialogue. And yeah, I know this is real boring stuff, but I wanted to give you all the details. So this is it. That's how the scene was. And once I got that scene done, the next thing for me to figure out was the lighting, the rendering. I wanted this scene to be my test scene. This was a nice big chunk, and I wanted this to establish the look, establish the pipeline, establish everything I had to do for the rest of the movie. And let's go on to that, and let's go on to the rest of the animation. Oh, before I go into that, okay, let me wrap up with motion capture. All the dialogue, all the lip syncing, all the acting was done that way. So at no point where the characters were talking or acting, none of that was hand animated. I would say that's a good 50% of the movie. And then for the rest of the stuff, when the beans are actually moving around, or they're fighting, or they're jumping around, I would say about half of the action. So okay, another 25% of the movie was using stock motion capture, because I said, okay, if it's there, if it's available, I'll use it. I'm not gonna reinvent the wheel or whatever. If I have a walking motion capture, sure, let's use it. Okay. The other 25% where I wanted really specific motions, or I couldn't find motion capture to fit those motions, then I would hand animate. And that mostly occurs during the action scenes, where you don't find motion capture that has the type of action that I wanted. So I had to sit down and hand animate. I know a lot of animators are gonna bust me up saying, "Oh yeah, it looks like, yeah, you use motion capture. Yeah, whatever, dude. You're not that good. That's all mocap. What are you talking about?" Yeah, sure, yeah, but I wanted, the key thing of making his movie was getting it done. That's the key thing, because if I didn't get it done, it wouldn't really matter. I would just be making a demo reel, right? But I needed to get this movie done, so motion capture helps speed up the process. And if I didn't use it, like I say, it was like 20 years. Oh, it might not be 20 years. It might be like 18, 17 years. But yeah, I don't know how long it would take, but definitely longer than what I did for this movie. So that's why I decided to use it. And as a filmmaker, you can't really hone in on one thing. When you're making a movie, there's so many parts in an animated movie. There's modeling, there's texturing, there's lighting, there's rendering, there's effects, there's animation. And I know a lot of people look at an animated movie and they really focus on animation, but it's still one part of making a movie. And when you're a director or producer, you can't just focus on one part. You have to look at the whole movie. and that's your job. So I had to look at the whole movie and just get it done. That was my goal. If I knew if I got it done, then it was an accomplishment, you know. So yeah, I couldn't really focus on animation. That would just burn me out too much. So after the animation pipeline was established, it was time to move on to figuring out the lighting, figuring out the rendering. Modeling, that was all complete. The characters were all done. I used a lot of prop models from, again, like stock models that you bought. Things like, you know where to find them. Textures, same thing. There was a lot of stock textures from texture DVDs or CDs. And the next thing was to figure out the lighting. So I knew, since I was the only one who was lighting the entire movie, I didn't want to light each shot individually. I had to focus on lighting per scene. So I need a lighting setup that was good enough for every single shot, every single angle, no matter if it's looking at me or if the camera's behind me or if it's the camera looking at the side. I needed a setup that was good enough for any angle that I conceived. And I started off with a dome light, like a standard dome light. Like I knew I wanted the global illumination type of look. I wanted that whole like current look, the up-to-date look. But I knew I couldn't render that because my render farm was not big enough. I only had 5 computers to render with. And we'll talk about rendering in a bit, but lighting. So I decided, okay, if I use a dome light, like that's just a bunch of lights set up in a dome over your scene, and it kind of emulates global illumination. And if I use that with some bounce lights, you know, maybe one, could be just one, right, coming from the ground, one directional light that represents the sun or some lights coming from wherever, one directional light that casts shadows. And then the other important thing is using ambient occlusion. And using ambient occlusion gives the characters a lot of soft shadows. It also gives tiny amounts of detail. So if you can see my keyboard, okay, this is a good example. So if you look in between the keys, you see all these dark shadows in here, and it gets darker the deeper you go. You know, that's occlusion, like the light's coming down, coming across, but in between the light's being occluded. So using ambient occlusion will show off a lot of details in your models and in your scenes and characters. So first pass was the color pass using a dome light setup, and here's an example render from that. If you look at it, it's pretty flat. It's kind of boring. It looks really dated. It looks like it was CG from back in the 1990s. There's like a directional shadow. It doesn't really add much. It's kind of, you know, whatever. We've seen it before. Game consoles can do that like 5 years ago. The other thing I wanted to add was a high dynamic range. I wanted to kind of fake the high dynamic range image-based lighting look on my scenes, and where that is apparent is mostly when objects are reflective. So if you look at this scene with my Killer Bean car, the highlights are much brighter than the rest of the scene, and that kind of fakes that whole HDRI look to it. And the way I did that was I had a sky dome, well, a sky sphere, like an environment sphere that had a texture for the sky, like the clouds and stuff like that. And then that was set with an ambience of like 0.75 or 1. And when you render that, so the sky would be just completely lit up. But reflection-wise, when a car reflects something with an ambience of 1, it's not that bright. It's kind of tame. So what I did was I made this sky dome. If you go into render stats, I turned off cast reflections. I turned off cast ray tracing. And I left primary visibility on, so that's what you're going to see when the scene renders. Then I duplicated this sphere, and I created another one that's a little bit bigger, and I turned off primary visibility, so you don't see this. When you're looking at the sky, you won't see the sphere. But I left on cast reflections, cast ray tracing, and I bumped up the ambience to like 2 or 3. So now, whenever you see this reflected into objects, it's going to be much brighter than looking at the sky. So if you look at the car, the reflections are much brighter. So if I bump this up to like 4 or 5, you're going to get really bright reflections, and that gives you the real nice HDRI look to it, but it's not really being lit by high dynamic range images. It just looks like, kind of looks like it is, right? So we have that's also part of my color image. I didn't really separate into reflection passes or anything like that because I'm kind of lazy. I'd rather not. I'd rather let the computer do that stuff. I don't want to do it myself. So the next thing I did was the ambient occlusion pass, and this pass was a real expensive pass to render in terms of computing power. So like color images took about 5 minutes of image, 5 minutes of frame in HD, and that's pretty fast. Ambient occlusion took about 10 minutes or more, 10 to 20 minutes per frame, and that took a long time. Okay, so we had our ambient occlusion frame, and most of the time you would just multiply this image on top of your color image, and let's bring this into Photoshop, and let's multiply it in. And that's the kind of image you get. And why I wanted to do something a little bit differently, I didn't really like the multiplied image because, okay, yeah, it looks like this. Instead, I tried out a bunch of different filters, and I tried overlay. And what overlay did was, it kind of used the ambient occlusion as almost like a lighting pass. So whatever is brighter than gray in your ambient occlusion, it brightens up your image. Whatever is darker than gray, it darkens your image. So it kind of gives it that dynamic range, like that. It's like a really cool sort of lighting. I mean, I don't know what the technical term is, even if there is one, I don't know. But it all comes down to, whoa, this looks much cooler. It looks a lot cooler. So what I did was I started making all my color images a lot darker so I could overlay the ambient occlusion. And this image was a good example. Look at Cromwell. And if you just multiplied it, you kind of lose that sunlight on his hat. But if you overlay it, it kind of, accentuates that sunlight on his hat. So it's slightly different. You can get the same type of look with a bright image and multiplying the AO layer on top. AO being ambient occlusion, but you would miss out on this cool little effect here, which I don't know, it looks pretty cool. So I decided to use it like that. So that was my lighting setup. It was just color pass with everything, textures, reflections, specular. I didn't separate anything into layers. The only other layer I had was the AO pass, and that was overlaid on top of the color pass. Let me think. So the other thing in terms of lighting rendering was the depth of field. Depth of field was ultra important to me. It was more so important than motion blur. Motion blur, actually, I would have liked motion blur, but to render motion blur was just too long. And I said, hey, I don't really miss motion blur. Hopefully you guys don't miss motion blur. But nothing in the movie had motion blur, so I skipped it because I didn't feel like I really needed it. But I felt like I really needed depth of field to give it that cinematic look. Because, film compared to video, film has a really shallow depth of field. Video has a really deep depth of field. So in video, you see everything a lot sharper. Like, if I was standing outside and you shot me on video, with a camera, all right? I know what you're thinking. Okay, so you shot me on video. The backgrounds, like if I was standing in front of a forest, the backgrounds, like the trees, would be pretty sharp. If you shot me on film with a shallow depth of field, maybe the background would be a little bit blurred out, depending how close the camera was to me. So, and going into technical details, the reason for that is because the aperture for a film camera is much bigger than the aperture for a video camera, etc. So, do you want me to get into this next time? Okay, that's another story. Okay, so depth of field was really important for that cinematic look because people distinguished a film camera from a video camera with shallow depth of field. So at first I used a Z depth buffer pass, and I did depth of field as a separate pass, and it was cool. I mean, it looked really nice. and that it required me to render a separate pass, and this is a kind of image that you would get. Things that are closer to camera are brighter, things that are farther away are darker, and that's what tells the third-party depth of field software how deep your scene is. But the only problem with that is, unless you're using 16-bit images, right now I'm using 8-bit Z-depth buffers, and that only gives you 256 levels of deepness, depth. So it wasn't that accurate, but the biggest thing for me was, well, okay, this is not the biggest thing, but another thing was that you couldn't really show transparent images, transparent objects. The stuff behind it was not blurred in depth of field. Also, anti-aliasing was a problem. Depending how strong the depth of field was, the objects that were sharp, you would get really weird anti-aliasing on the edges of those objects. But the big thing, okay, here's the big thing why I didn't use another Z-depth buffer pass using a third-party depth of field, was because it added so many steps to my rendering. So yeah, when the color layer was done, then the ambient occlusion layer was done, then I had to render a Z-depth pass, then I had to bring it into the third-party depth of field software, then I had to re-spit out those frames, and then finally the frame was done. That's like 2 or 3 more steps that it added to my whole rendering pipeline. So instead I decided to use in-camera physically true depth of field, and I used Final Render for that. Final Render is a really nice rendering software. It's for Maya. There's also for Cinema 4D and for 3D Studio Max. But that has true depth of field, and true depth of field uses ray tracing, so it shoots lots of rays out in your scene. It actually has a camera aperture, so the bigger your aperture, the shallower your depth of field is. It didn't have issues like anti-aliasing on objects, didn't have issues like transparent objects, and it also gave you nice bloom, like what do you call that? The what's the term for that? Where if you see a bright point behind you, and in shallow depth of field it becomes a big circle. Circle of confusion. That's right. Thanks, man. Thanks. So circle of confusion. The third-party software that I used had a circle of confusion, and that was cool. That gave you a true depth of field look. But yeah, this software did it all by itself. So when I used Final Render, the only thing I had to tell the software was where to focus the camera. So I would pick a camera, I would set its focal point to, like, okay, the character's eyes. I said, okay, that's going to be the focal point. Everything else is out of focus. And the rendering software handled that on its own, and it calculated the focal distance and also the aperture, things like that. Everything was physically true. And what that did was I didn't have to render this Z-depth buffer pass. I didn't have to go and put it through the third-party software. I didn't have to do compositing with all these different images. All I did was spit out a color layer with depth of field, and I spit out an ambient occlusion layer with depth of field. Now that's the biggest drawback of using physically true depth of field from your renderer. It's you have to render that in your color pass. You also have to render that same exact look in your ambient occlusion pass. And since ambient occlusion already was ray tracing heavy, it took a long time to render. Adding depth of field to it, true ray tracing depth of field to it, made these renders like crazy. Really made them crazy. So depending on the shot, some frames took almost 2 hours to render. That was bad. I had to go through some cheats to get these renders to render quickly, like rendering the ambient occlusion in lower resolution as opposed to the color frames. Color frames I rendered in HD, and in the ambient occlusion frames I would render slightly lower, maybe 960 by 540. You couldn't really tell because when you overlay this black and white image on top of the color image, it doesn't look, you can't tell that it's less resolution. You can't. Trust me, you can't. So that was the big thing, but the cool thing was it took away the steps from me. Like, I didn't have to manually sit behind the computer and start clicking and compositing and doing all this. All I had were 2 layers, color and AO. So the next thing I want to talk about before I go into my whole render farm, my whole render management system, is texturing. And I have a mantra for this movie to keep things simple. Keep things easy, okay? Because I don't want to do more work than I have to. This already took 5 years. You kidding me? So yeah, keep things easy. And so texturing, I kept everything as projections. I didn't use UV. Everything was a projection of some sort, either planar projection or triplanar projection. Triplanar was excellent for stuff like buildings or furniture, square furniture, planar, for whatever, anything else. And then if you take a look at this shader network, I had a bunch of different layers in these textures to kind of break up the texture. I didn't want a repetitive texture. So if you look at a building, there's going to be repetitive bricks. So I had to layer a big dirt layer on top that didn't repeat that much. I also added in some procedural textures because those never repeat. I mean, a dirt layer might repeat twice, right? A brick layer might repeat 5 to 10 times. A procedural layer never repeats. So that's different throughout the whole procedural texture. And that was it. That was my texturing pass. Like, I had no UVs because, quite frankly, I don't know how to UV. I kind of don't want to know how to UV. I mean, eventually I'm going to have to learn it. But yeah, I don't know how to do that stuff. I know some of you out there are like super experts at texturing, and you're saying like, you don't know how to UV? Yeah, don't. So I'm trying to make my movie, dude. So I didn't want to take time out to learn this stuff. Okay, so yeah, no UVing. That I'll save that for later. Okay. That was texturing. That was it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the effects in my movie. And, the movie's called Killer Bean Forever. So, stuff is going to blow up and shatter and crack or whatever. I don't know. What do you do when you blow up stuff? And so I used a lot of rigid body dynamics in Maya for gunshots that bounce off objects or bounce off the ground. I basically had a little polygonal cylinder, and I used the shatter feature in Maya, and I shattered the object, and I created all these different little shard pieces into rigid body dynamics. And after that, you can apply a force to them. So I used like the radii force, and then I applied gravity to it, and I would just apply that force for like a magnitude of like 500 for 1 or 2 frames, and then cut it off after the 4th frame, and it goes boop, and that's like a gunshot right into the ground, like a cement floor. I also had similar stuff. I just put the cylinder sideways, and I blew out pieces sideways. So after all these simulations were done, I would bake out every single piece, and I would kind of break it up, split up the cylinder into 3 groups, and I had like 3 different types of gunshots into the floor, off of furniture, things like that. Getting into explosions, smoke, fire type stuff, when the grenades blew up and stuff like that. I didn't really want to figure out a good particle system. I didn't have Maya Unlimited. I only had Maya Complete. And Maya Unlimited has all those fluids and stuff like that. You can simulate smoke and explosions. So I only had Maya Complete, and I didn't want to really learn how to make cool smoke with particles. Because I was like, okay, that's going to take me too long to learn. I might as well figure out how to do it quickly. So there's a great program called Particle Illusion 3, and that's sprite-based particles. And so I bought that, and then I bought some of the pro emitters that had some pre-made explosions, and they looked pretty cool. So what I did was I rendered those explosions out in Particle Illusion onto target files with alpha channels. And an alpha channel, it's like a cookie cutter. So anything that's white it'll show anything that's black is transparent. So I brought those images, it's like a sequence. An explosion might be like 100 frames. So I'd take those 100 frames, 1 to 100, project them onto a card, or we call them cards in like filmmaking or whatever, photography. But it's basically a polygonal plane that you put into your scene in Maya, and you project those images onto that plane. So at frame, you could start the image sequence at any frame. So say at frame 100, it's going to have frame 1 of this explosion, and frame 101 it has frame 2, frame 103 has frame 102 has frame 3. It's in a sequence. And my video card right now doesn't have much texture memory, so I can't really show you in real time, but when you render it out, it shows basically that explosion you rendered in particle illusion in your scene. It's kind of a cheap way of doing it. It gives it a really flat look. Doesn't make your explosion look like a volumetric explosion. So what I did was I had a bunch of different layers. Sometimes I put a smoke explosion, a different kind, behind this explosion, and then I would stick a point light in between those two layers, or maybe in front of it, and I would make these planes kind of translucent so that light can shine through, like the light will illuminate through these little planes here. So I made them translucent, and when you set it off, the light is synchronized with the explosion. So when an explosion happens, the light flashes and it casts light on everything around it. So it kind of marries that explosion into the scene. You know, it's kind of it is a cheat. It's not kind of a cheat. It is a cheat. It kind of works, especially since Killer Bean is a cartoony type character. These explosions work. That's it for effects. I don't think I had any other effects. I had gunshots, and the gunshots were actually just geometry. And I modeled a gunshot, a gunfire. And then what I did was, it's quite similar to what I did in Killer Bean 2, but I randomized it a bit, especially for machine gun fire. So what I did was I created a soft body object out of it, and then I added some noise or turbulence to it so that gunfire looks like it's flickering, like a candle flame or like some fire. And I baked it onto a blend shape. So the blend shape ran from, I don't know how long it was, like 1 to 500. I wanted it long enough in case the shots I were using the gunfire in case the shots were like 500 frames, I had enough frames to make this flame go, you know. You can also run the blend shape back and forth. What the whole point was, I wanted the gunfire to look different for each gun. I didn't push it that far, so it does look similar, but if you run a machine gun, if I used a machine gun in this scene and just ran it, the gunfire would look different on each shot. That's why I kind of used the soft body dynamics for that. And of course I had a point light inside the gunfire to kind of illuminate everything around it as the shot's going off. What else did I use? That's pretty much the extent of the effects. A lot of rigid bodies, a lot of particle illusion. That's it. All right. So let's go into my render farm. The equipment I used, the workstation I used, and how the heck did I render all these frames? The amount of frames I had was over 100,000. 100,000 frames for this movie. It was an 85-minute movie times 24 frames per second. That's like, I don't know, 125,000 frames. Something like that. Yeah, I did the math beforehand. So, and I had 2 layers each. I had the color layer and then the ambient occlusion layer. And ambient occlusion took a lot longer to render. So that's 250,000 frames I had to render with only 5 computers. I started off with like 2 or 3. There are quad cores, and I bought 2 more quad cores. This is when the quad cores just started coming out. So they were quite expensive, but they overclocked. And if you're a super geek like me, man, when you overclock, you get all that giddy and stuff, you know? You're like, I overclocked this. But first, before we get into that, let's look at my workstation, because you guys are going to laugh. Some of you guys out there, you're going to laugh, especially you guys playing video games all the time. I kind of stopped playing video games. I stopped playing about back in 2004. That was the last time I played video games because I wanted to get my movie done. But man, when you look at my computer, come here. Let's check it out. All right. So this is it. This is the workstation that I used to make my entire movie. And as you can tell, it's getting pretty dirty. But yeah, I was telling you video gamers out there that you'd probably laugh at my machine. This is really nothing special. I bought this about, I don't know when, 2006, 2005. I first started with a single core machine. This one's a dual core. And I put a nice big heatsink on there with a new fan. And this machine was overclocked from a 2.6 dual core up to 3.5. So it was pretty nice. When working in Maya, animating is not really multi-threaded yet, and it's not like rendering, where rendering is super multi-threaded. The more computers, the more cores you have, the faster it renders. But when you're animating and making test animations, it's not really multi-threaded yet, so less processors is fine, but just have the highest amount of gigahertz that you can. And that's why I overclocked this thing to about 3.5 gigahertz, 3.4. As you see down here, I replaced one of the motherboard heat sinks with my own dual heat pipe heat sink. Down here, now this is the reason why some of you might laugh. This is actually a GeForce 7300 GS, I think. Yeah. And that's quite slow. For those of you who don't know, it's a pretty low end system, but hey, it works to make a feature film. So hey, and that's a bunch of dust that I collected down here ever since the beginning. So my hard drives, I had a RAID system. I had these two 500 gigabyte hard drives set up in a RAID 0. Pretty fast, but not that secure. So what I did for backups, towards the beginning of the production, I backed up everything on DVD about once a month. And towards the last year or so, I backed up everything on DVD about once a week. So you never can be too safe. And I never did have a big catastrophe during this production. So I never went back to my backups, but I had them. Other than that, I did have a RAM drive in here. It kind of went busted, so I chucked it. But the RAM drive was nice because I installed Maya on there. It was about 4 gigabytes of super fast RAM drive space. Had all my applications on there, so when I clicked on the icon, it just pops up like in a matter of seconds, and that really helped speed up production. And yeah, I have hard drives hanging out, And the reason why I have the case open is because this machine is overclocked, so it tends to get really hot, and I need as much cool air to get in there as possible. So yeah, that's my workstation. All right. I could tell some of you wives at home are probably puking at the sight of this thing. Yeah, I can understand. Yeah, my wife would tend to agree with you. But hey, for us ultra geeks, it's a thing of beauty. Right? Am I right, guys? Alright. Let's move on to the render farm. If you think you would puke at this thing, wait till you see what's next. And behold, this is my render farm. Well, not really. I mean, this is a reenactment of what my render farm looked like. My real render farm was a lot messier than this. Hard to believe, yes. But this is what it looked like. This is how I set it up. I went caseless. There's no cases for these computers, but yes, these are all computers. I have 3 of them right here. Let's see. We have. There's one node here, one node here, one node here. Power supplies for all of them. And so why don't we take a look at one of these nodes. This one is a quad core machine. This was one of the first ones I bought. I kind of replaced the motherboard heatsink with this heat pipe version. And here you see this massive heatsink here. It's a 6 heat pipe heatsink, dual fan. This one's a regular 120 millimeter fan, about 25 millimeters high. This is a 38 millimeter 120 millimeter fan. This one is freaking noisy. It's really loud. Yeah, so I tend to turn that down. So yeah, this machine had about 3 gigabytes of memory, and then the hard drive is attached here. Reason for this huge heatsink is because I bought quad-core machines when they first came out, quad-core CPUs, and the first one I bought was a 2.4 gigahertz. It was made on a 65 nanometer process, which was an older process. Came out in 2006, I think, 2007, yeah, 2006 around then. But that was basically the smallest size a CPU can be manufactured to be quad-core. So this has four processors in one chip, and it tends to overheat because I overclocked this thing to 3 gigahertz, I think, and it came at 2.4, so all the heat has to go somewhere, so that's where all these fans come in. And this heatsink was pretty cool because it actually blew air down to the RAM chips down here, and so I had this connected with Ethernet here. Let's move on to the next one. For all you non-ultra geeks, this might not be exciting to you, but for all you ultra geeks out there, yeah, this is pretty cool, isn't it? So right here we have pretty much the same chip, quad-core, older quad-core in here, and what I have is a water cooling system. Here's the radiator, pumps coolant going through that pipe into this system here, which acts like the heatsink. So if you notice, this one's a lot smaller than that one. Performance-wise, it wasn't as good as this massive piece of hunk of metal, but you know, I was trying out different things, see what kind of stuff I should buy. This had 4 gigabytes of RAM, kind of mixed, didn't really matter too much. This one was overclocked to 3 gigahertz also. Yeah, let's take a look at the next one. Now this one was one of the later render nodes that I bought. This one was a 45 nanometer quad core, so it ran a lot cooler. Definitely ran a lot cooler. And this one was pumped up to 3.5 gigahertz. So that's 4 cores running at 3.5 gigahertz. And this one had 8 gigs of RAM. Each one of these are 2 gigabytes each. And yeah, this one was awesome. I loved it. I'm going to turn it into my workstation once I start my next project. But yeah, this one's a really cool one. And you notice this heat sink is quite unique. It's a lot smaller, and it actually uses its own self-contained coolant. You notice my water one had its blue coolant running from the radiator all the way down to the CPU. This one has coolant inside the heatsink already, so it goes from the CPU up into the radiator. The fan cools it down, and the cooled down coolant goes back down into the CPU. So it's kind of like a kind of a pumpless system here. It's really cool. This motherboard had an awesome heatsink going through all the different chips, so I didn't need these extra heatsinks that I put here. So yeah, that's my system, and yeah, it did get really hot, did get really noisy with all the fans going. That's why I kind of explored the water cooling systems, but they weren't that good. And they're all connected by this gigabit Ethernet switch, and that goes all the way down into this machine. This was my server, my file server, and this was actually underclocked. All my other ones were overclocked. This one was underclocked from 2 gigahertz down to 1 gigahertz, and the reason why I did that was because I wanted it to run 24 hours a day without crashing. So I still put the massive heatsink here. This is a very slow fan, actually makes no noise at all. So yeah, this thing ran all the time. I had all my hard drives here. This is where I stored all my master files and all my frames, my rendered frames, and I had a fan here blowing on those hard drives 24 hours a day. So yeah, my system did not run if this thing did not run. So that is my master file server. If you notice that everything on these motherboards, they're all pretty much decked out. CPU, processor, lots of RAM, hard drive, power supply, everything you need, except for no video cards. No video cards at all. And the reason why I did that was because I didn't want to buy video cards for all of them, and I ran all of them through Windows Remote Access. So that let me bring up windows of each machine onto my workstation, and it was really cool because I can control every single computer in this farm with just one computer, and I could see everything that each computer is doing. Really cool technique. So if you guys are building your own render farm, that might be an idea to use Windows Remote Access. And saved a lot of space, saved a lot of money on not buying video cards. And yeah, that's it. Anything else I want to talk about? So the reason why I went caseless is pretty much because to keep these systems cool, because all of them were overclocked, I had to keep them very cool. So I didn't buy cases because airflow could flow right through these machines, no problem. And I had the windows open in the wintertime and the room was still hot. I was living in the Bay Area and it gets pretty cold in the winter. But yeah, I had the windows wide open and these things just heated the entire apartment. My electric bill came out to be about $200 a month when all 5 were running. So it got to be pretty expensive, but hey, it's cheaper than having your own rent, cheaper than paying for a service. $200 a month ain't bad. So there you go. So music. I feel like music is a really important part of movie making because music sets the tone, it sets the mood of the scene. It kind of evokes emotion from the audience, and you could kind of cue the audience in on how you want them to feel. So I composed about 60 minutes of music in my movie, but I can't play any instruments. I can't even read notes. However, I am an awesome singer. I have an awesome voice. But yeah, I can't play any music. But so how did I compose the music? Well, I used this. It's a loop-based music program called Acid Pro, and what a loop-based music program does is you set different music loops together, like a drum track, then you have a guitar track, and maybe a bass track and a keyboard track. You put all those tracks together into a original song, if you can call it original. I mean, if you didn't play the instruments, but yeah, I call it original, so it is original. But what I could show you is how I exactly made the music for my movie, and let's just jump right in and take a look at how I did it. Okay, so what I have here is a blank slate, and up here is the track window. This is where I'm going to lay out the tracks for my different loops. Down here are the actual music loops. So I have my tempo set at 120 beats per minute, and why don't we just start and put in some loops here. I like to start off with the bass line. It kind of gives the essence of the song, so let's pick some bass lines here. No, kind of weird. Yeah, I like that. That's cool. So if you like something, you double click on it, bring it into the track window. Now you can draw the loops into the track, and we can extend it out here. But this is my time range here, and I have this looping. So what I could do is I could play this while I'm looking for another loop. So let's pick another bass line to go with it. Yeah, let me turn it a bit louder here. No, that doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. No. You know, the hardest part about finding loops is just finding loops that work together. Yeah, that's cool. Okay, I could work with this because it's kind of like building. The music is building up, you know? So that's cool. Let's put this in. And why don't we draw this in? Whoops, sorry about that. Let's draw this in there. Okay, so that's our bass line for the song. Let's add some drums and see where we go from here. Down to beats 110. Let's try 110. It's okay. It's okay. Getting there. So I like this. Let's add it in. It's okay. Okay, that's cool. This could be, I could use this in addition to another beat. So let's bring this in. Kind of different mood than I want, so, but it's good. I like it. Oh yeah, you you can hear that, right? Alright, so we can use it, but not for the whole song, so let's keep going. Okay, that's kind of mellow, so... Alright. That's good. We can use it as like a background beat, so let's bring that in. I don't want to bring in too many beats because the more loops you have in a window, the more cluttered it gets, so... Alright, that's enough beats for now. So what we'll do is we'll just draw this first beat in here. Okay, that's a good basic beat. So now let's bring in some keyboards or something like that. So let me see, where am I going? Alright, let's try synths. Let's see. No. You recognize that song, right? That's cool. I like that as a background. So let's bring that in. I can't even hear that. Well, you kind of get the idea. Okay, so from here, let's just start building our song. So I want to start with this mellow bass line. So let's listen to this by itself. Okay, that's kind of cool. So let's lead into this. Let's turn off the looping here. Draw that out. You know, it's building up. The song's building up. And let's add this. Oops. Okay, let's keep that. And then... Yeah, see, it doesn't work. But you get the idea. That's how I make music really quickly, actually. The hard part is actually finding loops that work together, and what I like to do sometimes is make the song first, then it kind of get inspiration, you know, to see where it can go in the movie. Other times I would get the scene together, and you know, for action scenes that are very specific, I would bring the scene into a window here so you can watch the movie, and then kind of compose the music to specifically for that scene. Other times, you know, I just like going by the mood. If it sounds cool, chances are I have a spot in it in the movie. So yeah, that's how I do music for Killer Bean Forever. In terms of other music where I couldn't really use loop-based music for important dramatic parts, like the scene where Killer Bean kind of gives up and it's a really dramatic moment, I wanted to use orchestral music, so I licensed a really good composer. His name is Justin Durbin, and you can check out his website. It's www.edgin.com, and I'll right there. Okay, so yeah, I licensed music from him, and he created some really good stuff. So if you're looking for cool orchestral music for your animated film, check him out. Check him out. He's pretty cool. So that's about it for music. And if you like, you could check out the soundtrack to Killer Bean Forever. It's on my website somewhere. Okay, so let's move on. So sound effects were done in quite a similar way to the loop-based music, and I use sound effects samples. And I bought an entire collection of sound effects, and there was 10 CDs that had about 1,500 different sounds, and it sounded great. It had some awesome sounds, but the hardest part about using sound effects collections is that they separate them into different categories like car sounds, door sounds, human-made sounds, punches, kicks, stuff like that. And yeah, that's cool. You can kind of look through sounds like that. And then for each sound, they had different descriptions like, oh, crackling glass or hard pounding on a door, stuff like that. But you still didn't know what it sounded like unless you listened to the sound. So doing that for like 1,500 different sounds was quite tedious, and my ears started to hurt after a while. So, but it's cool. I mean, I couldn't have recorded all those different sounds on my own. That would have taken forever. So right here, what I have here is Sony Vegas, and this is a video editing software that's capable of doing 5.1 surround sound. So I use this software for all my sound effects layout. So let's take a look in here, and what I have here is, this is a layout that I have for the end fight scene in the movie. It's a kung fu fight scene for those of you who haven't seen the movie. And I'll just play it for now. Let me turn it up. So it's a lot of punches and kicks and all that stuff. What I did was I had the video up. I don't have it up right now, but I had the video up, and then for each punch I would go through like a punch pass and figure out what kind of punches I wanted. And I had to make sure that I didn't repeat different sounds. Like I didn't want a repetitive punch sound that you heard for every punch. And then I went to like a swoosh pass, and then maybe a kick pass, and a body landing on the floor pass, things like that. And then I also, after I picked all the sounds, then I went into the surround sound editor. And right here you have the surround panel. Let me pull off this panel here. And over here you can animate the sound going from like the left speaker to the right speaker, or the left speaker going across to the back right speaker, things like that. So it is truly 5.1 surround sound. And that was it. That was basically sound effects. Sound effects were really tedious. It was something I didn't really enjoy that much, but I had to do it because my movie would not be that good if I didn't have sound effects. So yeah, that's the sound effects of Killer Bean Forever. So that was the entire process of creating Killer Bean Forever, and I hope you guys enjoyed this movie making process. It was a long journey, a long one, and I hope to make more movies, and hopefully you guys will start making movies. And if you are making movies, good luck. You know, just finish it up. That's the entire battle, just finishing up. So yeah, I hope you learned some stuff. If not, hope you got some insight on what it takes to make a feature film. And I'll see you next time. Check me out at my website, www.jefflue.com or killerbeanforever.com, and I'll be updating those websites with news about what I'm doing in the future. Okay, so keep animating, keep filmmaking, keep watching movies. All right.